Recently, I involuntarily came into the possession of a book. This is a climate-skeptical book, Unsettled, by Stephen Koonin. Koonin has quite a history in science, having been the former Undersecretary for Science of the DOE under the Obama administration. The qualification here I consider to be quite important is that Koonin is not a climate scientist or something adjacent. He is a theoretical physicist. I was infinitely curious as to how this science-based politician can attempt to explain away climate change. This curiosity meant that I have gathered several of the most emphasized points repeated throughout the book to debunk and dismantle. Before I get into the quote-unquote evidence I will be analyzing, here were my first thoughts. I immediately took notice to just how laissez-faire Koonin's approach to climate change is. Before every item of evidence, he says something that follows this pattern: a concession. Yes, anthropogenic climate change is real, and always to his padding. It's not as bad as you think, though. For a book that seems like an argumentative piece, there is very little consistency or any commitment to his own ideas being presented. This book's subtitle, What Climate Science Tells Us, What It Doesn't, and Why It Matters, is exemplified by Koonin's perfectly ridiculous argument against climate history. Bringing me to point 1. Despite the certainty with which projections are reported as facts, estimating human influences is a highly uncertain business. Well, this is definitely news to me and every climate scientist who constantly reiterates how working with such a new science is challenging and uncertain every step of the way. Here, Koonin likens the curiosity of retrofuturism, the wonder and unknowingness of mid-century technology predictions, to the uncertainty of climate science. The argument is that historically, humans have not been very accurate in their modeling and predictions of the state of the future. The fallacy of this is immediately apparent, as Zeke Housefather established in his 2020 publication titled Evaluating the Performance of Past Climate Model Projections. The purpose of this paper is to examine the accuracy of climate models published since 1970. When looking at the plots, it's clear that the majority of data gathered tracks very well with data collected decades later. Some outliers stand, but these often exist because of the high emission and low emission prediction scenarios which climate models often utilize, creating a range of possible results. Housefather's publication shows how modern climate models are quite proficient and about as certain as we can get with climate science. And on to Koonin's second point, heat waves in the US are now no more common than they were in 1900, and the warmest temperatures in the US have not risen in the past 50 years. It is quite easy to disprove this second point only months after the publication of Koonin's book. 2021 has broken many historical temperature records, including Death Valley setting Earth's highest reliably measured temperature on July 9, 2021. Moving on to heat waves, I reference a publication by Simon J. Brown. Compared to 2006, absolute temperatures of 4 to 10 day-long heat waves are projected to be between 3.4 to 6.6 degrees Celsius hotter in 2099. Though the magnitude of the increases are independent of heatwave rarity and duration. Also important to note is heat stress, defined by Mukherjee as the increased frequency, severity, and spatiotemporal extent of extreme temperature and humidity. To quote, "The contribution from climate change alone more than doubles the impact in the coastal Pacific Northwest, Central California, and the Great Lakes region, implying a substantial increase in heat stress risk without aggressive mitigation efforts." Koonin's third point. Humans have had no detectable impact on hurricanes over the past century. One of the concessions that Koonin makes, where he acknowledges that anthropogenic climate change is real, is that sea level rise can be directly attributed to human activity. This is another point he tries to undermine, trying to challenge it with an, "I swear it isn't as bad as it sounds, here's a graph," despite his criticisms of the uncertainty of exactly the data he's pulling. Since we agree that sea level rise is anthropogenic, it is then important to recognize how sea level rise greatly contributes to hurricane severity. Strauss's publication uses hypothetical sea levels relative to the real sea levels when Hurricane Sandy occurred to demonstrate the scope of the damage increase caused by sea level rise. Using everyone's favorite example of hurricane damage, Katrina, it is clear how infrequently infrastructure such as New Orleans' levee system is repaired or updated. This would be exacerbated by sea level rise, making it even more challenging to fortify cities against hurricanes. And point 4, Greenland's ice sheet isn't shrinking any more rapidly today than it was 80 years ago. As shown by this graphic from data collected by Gjedsted, The per-year average ice loss during 2003 to 2010 is roughly 2.5 times higher than during 1900 to 2003, not to mention the unprecedented rate at which we have been witnessing sheet melting as of late. Furthermore, this melting has generated a measurable sea level rise over the last 20 years. And to put things further into perspective, Bowers points out how positive melt elevation feedback is a very likely result of perceived stability in melting rate. This will result in substantially enhanced melting in the near future. And on to point 5. Koonin says that the net economic impact of human-induced climate change will be minimal through at least the end of the century. What? This is a very bold statement to make. An excellent piece led by Brøns-Petersen goes in depth into the possible economic consequences of global warming. He recognizes how the adverse growth effect of global warming is significant and large, implying a 3.4% drop in global GDP from a 1 degree Celsius temperature rise, and that is only per single degree Celsius change. Environmental impacts simply cannot be separated from the economy, as seen time and time again by the correlation and causation between economic and ecological devastation from natural disasters. Koonin's point 6 is that the results from the multitude of climate models disagree with or even contradict each other in many kinds of observations. I'll start the way that Koonin likes to start points. Of course, climate models have disagreement because of the inherent uncertainty that he thinks climate scientists don't recognize. Climate literature is just like every other field of science, lost of silent or not so silent arguments and dissent. But massive agreements have been reached. Climate scientists have reached consensus on multiple occasions, and these agreements are quite public. However, party loyalties have caused distrust of this consensus. Republican tendencies caused a reaction to see the wording of this consensus as manipulative. Because of this partisanship, it is easy to dismiss huge climate consensus reached, despite the fact that climate conventions reach similar conclusions at least annually. And point 7, cherry picking of timeframes and data sets leads to misleading conclusions regarding climate change. Oh, Koonin, you silly little hypocrite. Why don't I pull some of your graphs together and we can have a little chat? This is my personal favorite. Except wait, this is the original from the publication he cited, not the one used in his book. This is the one he used, and the poor quality scan I had to take to show you. I totally understand simplifying the data here for easier consumption, since the book's target audience is very general. Here, Koonin is pulling data figures from the entire history of the Earth and claiming this is vital information in proving how warming and cooling occur in cycles. This manages, however, to disregard the state of the biosphere as it is today, especially the presence of humans at all. How can we analyze anthropogenic climate change while removing the anthro? A great quote criticizing a positive review of this book is by Kerry Emanuel, a professor of atmospheric science at MIT. He said, early in the review, the novelist Michael Crichton is quoted as saying, if it's consensus, it isn't science. If it's science, it isn't consensus, period. But those making policy would be foolish not to go with the scientific consensus. Anything else would almost by definition be subjective. What is the point of quoting Crichton if not to cast doubt on the value of scientific consensus? The existence of a consensus is not at all tantamount to the idea that the science is settled. Koonin's misleading logical fallacies have already begun to enter the minds of those searching for a way to escape their guilty conscience of something so catastrophic.